There's a moment in the Logtown arc that most people remember as a lucky escape. Buggy catches Luffy, ties him to the execution platform, raises the blade, and just before it comes down, lightning strikes out of nowhere and saves him. Everyone cheers. The crew runs. Story moves on. But what they all forgot was that Luffy had a real, settled smile. The kind of expression that made Smoker, one of the most perceptive Marines we've seen, stop cold, because he'd seen that look before on Goldie Roger in the same public square on the day of his execution. That parallel is explicitly drawn in the manga, and it's the thread this entire video is going to pull on, because Luffy is not just a fun protagonist who happens to win his fights. If you actually trace every major confirmed moment across the series, you start to see a psychological profile that is genuinely unlike anything else in the medium. There's a logic to everything he does. It's just running on a completely different operating system than everyone else's. Today, we're building that profile, arc by arc. Let's get into it. In the flashback that opens the story, young Luffy is watching Shanks's crew at the bar in Fuchsia Village. He wants to join them. Shanks laughs it off. The kid has no devil fruit, no fighting ability, no credentials of any kind. So Luffy picks up a knife and stabs himself under the eye to prove he isn't scared. Let that land for a second. Before he ever ate the gum-gum fruit, before he ever threw a punch at anyone who mattered, his very first act of self-definition was physical harm in the name of conviction. The scar that moment left is still on his face. 1,000 chapters later, he's never tried to explain it away. He's never tried to hide it. But, and this is where things get interesting, Shanks still didn't take him. He told Luffy he wasn't ready, and Luffy accepted it without argument. This moment tells us something most people miss. Luffy's fearlessness was never about proving himself to others. The scar was a promise he made to himself. Now, fast forward to Logtown. The smile. He's fought his way across the East Blue. He has a crew. And here he is, about to be executed, and he's calm, settled, completely at peace with it. That's not stupidity, that's radical acceptance and a fully formed worldview at work. And then there's Sabo de Archipelago. St. Charlos shoots Hachi at the auction house, and before anyone in that crowd can even process what happened, because attacking a celestial dragon means an admiral gets dispatched and people nearby tend to die, Luffy is already walking toward him, calmly, through a crowd that is diving for cover. One punch. Charlos goes down. No speech. No negotiation. He doesn't raise his voice. He just walks over and hits him. But this single decision costs everything in the short term. Kizaru arrives. The crew gets scattered across the world. The Sabaody disaster, which becomes one of the most psychologically devastating experiences of Luffy's life, begins with that one punch. The fact that he did it anyway tells you that his fearlessness is made of a hierarchy, and sitting at the top of that hierarchy, above his own safety, above tactical thinking, above even keeping his crew together, is the refusal to watch someone he cares about get hurt while he stands there doing nothing. That's the engine underneath all of it. Once you see it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Quick pause before we keep going. If you've been watching this channel and you're not subscribed yet, I genuinely need you to fix that right now. It is the difference between you seeing the next video or just finding it completely by accident 3 months later. One tap. Thanks. And now we continue. Anyway, Luffy's loyalty. Here's the moment that defines it. Arlong Park. Nami has been working under Arlong her entire life, collecting money village by village, believing she could eventually buy her people's freedom. Arlong has been moving the goalposts every single time she gets close. When Luffy finds her, she's at her absolute limit. She's stabbing at her own arm, at the Arlong tattoo she's been forced to wear. And when Luffy arrives, she can't quite say, "Save me." Years of conditioning have made it almost physically impossible for her to ask for help. What she eventually manages is just, "Help me." And Luffy doesn't ask questions, doesn't ask for context, doesn't need her to justify anything or explain whether she deserves it. He takes off his straw hat, the single most important object in his life, given to him by Shanks, the symbol of his entire dream, and places it on her head. Then he tells his crew to destroy Arlong Park. That's it. That's the whole thought process. But here's what makes this more interesting than a simple Luffy is loyal moment. His loyalty isn't blind. Look at Water 7. When Usopp challenges Luffy to a duel over what to do with the Going Merry, Luffy fights him, wins, and then, critically, doesn't call him back. Luffy demonstrates leadership during dire times by taking on the burden of dueling Usopp and restraining himself from calling Usopp back. He lets Usopp leave, because loyalty, in Luffy's psychology, isn't about keeping everyone close, no matter what. It comes with a standard. You have to show up for him the same way he shows up for you. What we're actually looking at isn't unconditional loyalty in the sentimental sense. It's loyalty with weight behind it. He will move mountains for the people in his crew, but he won't pretend they didn't do what they did. That's a more emotionally mature position than most protagonists 3 times his age ever reach. This pattern reaches its breaking point at Marineford, because Arlong Park is the promise. Marineford is what happens when the promise isn't enough. Everything we've seen about Luffy's capacity for sacrifice and loyalty eventually collides head-on with the one thing no amount of selflessness can fix: being too late. Let me be very precise about what actually happens in the manga here, because the specifics are what matter. Luffy breaks into Impel Down. He takes Magellan's poison directly and survives only through Ivankov's intervention. He arrives at Marineford already broken, patched together, running on almost nothing. He fights through an entire war's worth of warlords and admirals to reach the execution platform. He gets to Ace, and then, in what the manga confirms as one of the most significant moments in the entire series, Admiral Akainu attacks. Ace steps in front of it. Ace dies in Luffy's arms. Think about what that means given everything we've established. This is the boy who laughed at his own execution, the boy who smiled in Logetown the way Roger smiled, the boy who once stabbed his own eye to prove he wasn't afraid of anything. He doesn't break when Kizaru scatters his crew at Sabaody. He doesn't break when he's poisoned in Impel Down. He doesn't break during Marineford itself. He breaks when Ace dies, because all of the fearlessness, all of the sacrifice, all of the carrying people up mountains and burning flags and punching celestial dragons, none of it was ever about him. It was always about them. And for the first time, despite everything he gave, it wasn't enough. But the most important moment in this entire arc isn't the breakdown. It's the conversation with Jinbei that follows. Jinbei tells Luffy something that nobody has ever successfully gotten through to him before. Stop counting what you've lost. Count what you still have. You still have a crew. You still have people waiting for you. You still have a reason to stand up. For the first time in the series, Luffy sits with grief instead of punching through it. He acknowledges what he's lost. He doesn't rush past it. And then, slowly, deliberately, he decides to rebuild. Not because the grief is gone, but because the people who are still alive need him to be stronger. The 2-year time skip is the direct physical result of that decision. He trains under Rayleigh. He learns Haki properly. He develops things he's never had before. But the internal shift that actually matters, the one that separates the post-time skip Luffy from every other version of him, happened in that moment with Jinbei, when he understood for the first time that fearlessness without power is just a promise you can't keep. The man who comes back to Sabaody 2 years later is still Luffy. Same hat, same grin, same completely unreasonable confidence, but the recklessness has been replaced with something more deliberate. He still charges into impossible situations, but now you can tell he's choosing to. Here's something that sounds like a contradiction until you look at it closely, but Luffy explicitly said that he doesn't want to be a hero. At first glance, that looks like a contradiction. It isn't. In Dressrosa, he gets told repeatedly to stay out of the country's problems. He gets involved anyway, because Doflamingo has hurt people connected to people Luffy knows. He forms alliances with the Tontata dwarves, not because dwarves deserve freedom as an abstract principle, but because these specific dwarves are suffering in front of him. And here's where it gets philosophically interesting, at least to me. His moral compass doesn't point toward a fixed ethical north. It points toward the people in front of him. But the people in front of him, across virtually every arc, consistently turn out to be the oppressed, the exploited, the people the world government and the nobles would prefer, didn't make noise. Luffy ends up doing genuinely heroic things without ever deciding to be a hero. His justice is a side effect of his loyalty. He doesn't fight systems. He fights the person in front of him who is hurting the person next to him. The system just keeps getting in the way. I think that's actually a more honest version of justice than the ideological kind. Ideology can be corrupted, reinterpreted, weaponized, but that person hurt my friend, and I'm going to stop them. That doesn't have a loophole. There is a line at Marineford that comes from the last person you would expect to say something like it, Dracule Mihawk. the world's greatest swordsman, a man who measures everything by the blade, who spent decades defining himself by being the absolute apex of one craft, watches Luffy at Marineford and identifies what he believes to be the most dangerous power in the world, his ability to make allies out of everyone he meets. This is confirmed in the manga. Mihawk says this directly. And the reason it carries so much weight is that Mihawk is not someone who compliments things easily or frequently. For him to name that quality, to name it specifically as dangerous and specifically as the most dangerous, that's not praise. That's a threat assessment. Think about what it looks like in practice. Mr. 2 Bon Clay, who was literally on the opposing side in Alabasta, risks his own life to help Luffy escape Impel Down. Crocodile, who nearly killed Luffy multiple times and has every reason to despise him, ends up fighting on the same side at Marineford. After the events of Dressrosa, a grand fleet of thousands of pirates pledges to respond when Luffy calls, and Luffy didn't even ask for it. He actually tried to refuse. None of this is manipulation. None of it is strategy. Luffy doesn't cultivate alliances the way a politician would. He doesn't calculate how people can be useful to him later. Here's what actually produces this effect. Luffy has no hierarchy for human worth. He treats everyone, pirates, kings, fishmen, giants, skeleton musicians, with the same version of himself. He extends the same attention, the same energy, the same willingness to eat with you and fight for you, regardless of what category the world has decided to put you in. When Hachi, a fishman, a former enemy, someone who had directly participated in Nami's suffering, was shot by Charlos, Luffy didn't weigh the history. Hachi was now someone he considered a friend. That was the whole calculation. And because of that calculation, Luffy took on an admiral, the entire world government apparatus, and the worst possible timing for his crew, without hesitating for a second. But what this means at scale is something even larger than individual loyalty. In a world absolutely saturated with hierarchies, warlords and nobles and admirals and emperors, and systems designed to tell you exactly where you rank and what you're worth, the person who walks through all of that and treats you like a person is going to stand out in a way that nothing else can replicate. That's not a devil fruit ability. That's not haki. That's something the world doesn't have a counter for, because it doesn't fit into any of the categories the world uses to measure threat. Mihawk understood that, and when the greatest swordsman alive tells you that a rubber boy's ability to make friends is more dangerous than any weapon he's ever faced, maybe take that seriously. Let me bring this back to where we started. Here's what I think what us fans consistently underrate. Luffy's simplicity isn't a character flaw that the story works around. It's the source of everything that makes him extraordinary. The boy who stabbed his own eye at 7 years old, the teenager who smiled at his own execution, the captain who placed his greatest treasure on a crying girl's head and went to war without asking a single question. They're all the same person, running on the same logic because he has no ideology to get corrupted, no hierarchy of people worth saving, no political calculation that could convince him to leave someone behind. He's been called a lot of things by several characters over the years. Simple, reckless, an idiot who got lucky. But based on canon evidence, he is one of the most deliberately and psychologically coherent protagonists in manga history. That's all for this one. If there's a specific arc or a character moment you think I missed, drop it in the comments. I read all of them. See you in the next one.